I never thought I'd be writing this down, but after everything that happened, I can't keep it to myself anymore. I have to get it out. My name is Sarah, and I'm the only survivor of what happened at Ashford Hospital. They tried to shut me up to make it seem like I was crazy, but I know the truth. What I saw was real. No one will ever believe me, but I'm begging you to listen. This isn't just a nightmare or a figment of my imagination. This is a warning. I was an intern at Ashford, one of the most renowned medical facilities in the country. It was a towering structure built in the late 1800s, a Gothic monstrosity with high ceilings, dim hallways, and an eerie, almost oppressive atmosphere. When I first arrived, I was excited. I thought it was a great opportunity, a place where I could learn from the best and make a real difference in the lives of my patients. But there was something wrong with that place, something I couldn't put my finger on at first. The older staff members would warn me about working the night shifts, speaking in hushed tones about the building's history, but I brushed it off as superstition. I should have listened. It started with the sounds. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, creaks and groans from the old pipes and walls, but then I started hearing voices. Low, whispering voices that echoed through the corridors at night. They were so faint that I couldn't make out the words, but they sent a chill down my spine. Every time I walked past the old wing of the hospital, the one that hadn't been used in years, the whispers seemed louder. There was something in that wing, something I didn't want to know about. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just my imagination, the stress of being in such a high-pressure environment. But things began to get worse. Patients started acting different. Some would scream in the middle of the night, pleading for help. Others would whisper about things I couldn't understand. One patient, an elderly woman named Mrs. Jensen, kept talking about someone who wasn't there. She'd stare at the corner of the room, her eyes wide with terror, and whisper, "She's coming. She's coming. For me." The nurses told me it was just dementia, but I had a feeling it was something else. One night, as I was walking through the hospital's halls, I found myself near the old wing again. The whispers were louder this time, more frantic. I tried to ignore them, but something was pulling me in. I had to see what was in there. The doors to the old wing were locked, but there was a small maintenance entrance that I knew about. I crept through the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, and snuck inside. The air inside was thick, stale, and smelled of mildew. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floors creaked under my weight. As I walked deeper into the wing, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. I couldn't make out the words, but it was as if the very walls were speaking. I felt cold, a cold that seemed to seep into my bones. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hall, there was a door slightly ajar. I could see faint light coming from inside, and I couldn't resist. I walked toward it, my breath quickening. The closer I got, the more the air felt charged, as if something was watching me, waiting for me. I reached for the door and slowly pushed it open. What I saw in that room still haunts me. It wasn't just a storage room, as I expected. It looked like a patient's room, but everything inside was covered in dust, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. The bed was still there, the sheets yellowed and torn. There was a rocking chair in the corner, slowly moving back and forth, despite there being no wind. But the worst part wasn't the room itself. It was the figure in the corner. A woman, pale and gaunt, sitting in the chair, her back to me. Her hair hung down in matted strands, and she was wearing an old-fashioned hospital gown. At first, I thought she was just another patient, maybe one who had been left behind, forgotten in the building's decay. But then she turned her head. Her eyes, those eyes, were empty. There was no life in them, just hollow, black sockets that seemed to stare right through me. Before I could react, I heard a voice, clear as day, whisper in my ear, "Get out!" I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty, oppressive hallway behind me. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in that room with the ghostly figure. The woman in the chair began to rock faster, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. I could see my breath in the air. Suddenly, the woman stood up. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if she hadn't moved in years. She slowly turned toward me, and that's when I saw it, the face. Her skin was stretched tight over her skull, her lips pulled back in a grotesque smile. Her teeth were yellow and jagged, like broken shards of glass. Her hand reached out to me, her long, bony fingers twitching. I screamed, and that's when I ran. I don't remember how I got out of that room, but I did. I fled the hospital that night, my heart pounding in my chest, and I never looked back. I told myself it was just a hallucination, that I had been overworked and exhausted. But the nightmares started soon after. I couldn't sleep without seeing her face. I couldn't walk past that part of the hospital without feeling her eyes on me. She was always there, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. And the worst part, I wasn't the only one who saw her. It wasn't long before other patients and staff members started reporting similar experiences. More whispers, more strange sightings, more inexplicable events. The hospital's administrators tried to brush it off, but then the accidents started happening. Staff members began to fall ill, their bodies found in locked rooms with no explanation. One nurse, a woman named Caroline, was found dead in the same room where I'd seen the ghostly figure. Her body was twisted in unnatural angles, her eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. The police were called in, but they couldn't explain it. They tried to say it was an accident, that the hospital was just old and falling apart, but I knew better. Something was wrong with that place. It was haunted, but no one would listen to me. No one except for Dr. Barnes. Doctor Barnes was an old psychiatrist who had been working at Ashford for decades. He had been one of the few who wasn't afraid to speak about the hospital's dark past. He told me about the patients who had been kept in that old wing, patients who had never been treated, who had been abandoned by their families. They had been subjected to cruel and inhumane experiments, their bodies and minds destroyed by the staff in the name of progress. Some of them had died in that room, and their souls had never left. I learned that the hospital had been built on the site of an old asylum, a place where the mentally ill were subjected to barbaric treatments. The spirits of those who had suffered still haunted the halls, trapped in a cycle of torment and pain. And then one night, I saw her again. She was standing in front of my bed, her face inches from mine. Her cold fingers reached for me, and I felt her breath on my skin. I screamed, but no sound came out. The ghost of the woman in the rocking chair whispered in my ear, "You can't leave." The next morning, I was found unconscious in my apartment, my body covered in bruises and scratches. The doctors said I had suffered a breakdown, but I know what happened. The woman from the old wing had claimed me, just like she had claimed so many others before me. They tried to say I was crazy, that it was all in my head, but I know the truth. Ashford Hospital is haunted, and the spirits of the patients who were tortured there will never rest. They are still watching, still waiting, and they won't stop until they have their revenge. I don't know what happened to the hospital after I left. They closed it down for a while, but I'm sure it's still standing. Somewhere, deep inside, the ghosts of those tormented souls are still there, waiting for the next victim, waiting for someone to enter the old wing, and when they do, they'll be ready.
Next story.
I still remember the night I was admitted to St. Margaret's Asylum. It wasn't my choice. In fact, I'd been resistant, even hostile to the idea, but my family insisted. They said I was losing touch with reality, that I was delusional, talking about things that didn't make sense. My thoughts were tangled in dark corners, haunted by memories I couldn't escape, but none of them understood. None of them could feel the chill that crept up my spine every time I looked at the old hospital buildings, the ones that had been here for generations, some parts abandoned, others in constant disrepair. I was only 24 when they checked me in, a young woman with a fragile mind, or so they thought. The doctor's diagnosis was vague: anxiety, depression, possibly some form of paranoia. Nothing that couldn't be treated with medication and therapy, they claimed. But nothing could prepare me for what I would experience in the walls of St. Margaret's. The moment I stepped through those iron gates, something felt wrong. The air was thick with something other than the usual hospital disinfectant. It was as if the place itself had a dark history it was desperate to hide. I didn't know then, but I would soon learn that the halls were steeped in death, suffering, and souls that never found peace. That first night was the beginning of everything. The staff were distant, kind but detached, almost as if they weren't truly present in the moment. Maybe they had seen too many patients come and go, but their eyes lacked warmth, their voices hollow, like they were all just going through the motions of a routine they'd performed for decades. I was assigned a small room in the East Wing, an older section of the asylum, one that hadn't been renovated in years. The faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and the heavy scent of mildew lingered in the air. The window was cracked open just a little, letting in the howling wind that rattled the panes at night. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect someone to recover, but I didn't have much of a choice. That first night, I lay awake for hours. The bed felt wrong beneath me, too soft, like it was sinking into the floor. I kept hearing whispers, faint at first, just beyond the edge of my consciousness. I'd sit up, straining to listen, but the voices would stop. It was the kind of thing that would make your skin crawl, like someone was watching you, waiting for you to fall asleep so they could come closer. By the second night, things had escalated. The whispers became clearer, more distinct, until they were like a chorus of voices murmuring all around me, though no one was there. I tried to call for the nurse, but when I stood up, my legs felt like lead, heavy and uncooperative. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I made my way toward the door, but when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. I screamed. I pounded on the door with my fists, but no one came. The whispers turned into soft, guttural laughs like someone was mocking me from the shadows. Panic surged through me, but it felt like I was trapped in a nightmare where I couldn't move or escape. And then I saw it. A figure appeared at the foot of my bed, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, wearing a tattered hospital gown, its face obscured by long, tangled hair. I could feel its eyes on me, burning through the darkness. A chill swept over me, and I realized with a growing sense of horror that it wasn't human. Not anymore. It started to move closer, dragging its feet across the floor, the sound of its movement a sickening scrape. My body froze, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed by fear, but eventually the figure was gone. The door opened and I collapsed into the hallway, gasping for air. A nurse rushed toward me, concern painted across her face, but I could barely explain what had happened. The words wouldn't come. She just led me back to my room, assuring me it was probably just a bad dream. But it wasn't. Not a dream. Over the following days, the horrors intensified. I learned that I wasn't the only one who had seen things. A woman in the ward next to mine told me she had seen patients in the halls at night, patients who had died long ago. "They don't leave," she whispered to me one evening, her voice shaky. "They stay here. They never get out." It wasn't long before I realized she was right. I started seeing the shadows that moved on their own, figures in the periphery of my vision that would vanish when I turned my head. But it wasn't just the ghosts of the past that haunted St. Margaret's. There were stories. Terrible stories of the asylum's history. I overheard the staff talking one night in hushed voices about the old wing, the one I had been placed in. It had been a part of the hospital since it was first built in the 1920s, and before that it had been used for something else, something much darker. In the early years, the asylum had been notorious for its treatment of patients. Electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and other cruel practices had been routine. They didn't care about healing, they cared about control. The patients were seen as less than human, their pain just another part of the process. The stories of torture, death, and madness were still whispered about among the staff, but they refused to acknowledge the truth. They would rather pretend it never happened. But the ghosts remembered. One night after I had finished a group therapy session, I wandered down a hallway I had never seen before. It wasn't on any of the maps I had been given. The lights flickered above me as I walked, and I felt a sudden coldness creeping into my bones. The hallway stretched on forever, lined with closed doors, each one marked with faded numbers. I passed a door that seemed different from the others. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack I could see a dim light flickering inside. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The room was small, barren except for an old chair in the center of the floor, its wooden frame splintered and broken. The walls were lined with old photographs, some of patients, some of staff. But the most disturbing thing was the chair. It looked like it had been used recently. And when I stepped closer, I saw the bloodstains, old but still unmistakable. I turned to leave, but as I did, I saw something move in the corner of the room, a shadow shifting unnaturally, and then the unmistakable sound of soft, labored breathing. I froze. From the darkness, a voice whispered, "Help me." I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, the voice echoing in my mind, a soft plea for mercy, a cry for release. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. The room was silent once again. I never spoke of that night to anyone in Japan, but I couldn't forget it. The asylum's history was haunted, and the ghosts of its past wouldn't let me forget it. The whispers became more frequent, the shadows more menacing. I started seeing them during the day, patients who had long since passed, roaming the halls, their hollow eyes following me wherever I went. One evening, as the sun set and the asylum grew quieter, I walked into the common room, only to find it filled with people who shouldn't have been there. They sat in chairs, staring blankly ahead, their faces gaunt and lifeless. They were dressed in old hospital gowns, their eyes vacant like they were waiting for something. I stood frozen in the doorway, my breath catching in my throat. And then one of them turned toward me, their face pale and twisted in a grotesque smile. It was a smile that sent a chill through my entire being, the kind of smile that said they knew something I didn't. "Join us," they whispered, their voice like a cold wind. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my room, but I knew deep down that I was never truly alone in St. Margaret's. The spirits of the past, the forgotten souls, were still there, trapped in the walls, in the rooms, in the very air I breathed. They had a claim on this place, and they weren't going to let me leave.
Next story.
I used to be a skeptic. I didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or anything supernatural. I thought it was all just stories told to scare people, things that couldn't possibly be real. That was before I worked at St. Mary's Asylum. It was supposed to be a routine assignment for me. I had just graduated from nursing school and was placed there to gain experience. St. Mary's was an old building, originally opened in the 1800s as a place for the mentally ill, but over time, it had turned into an overcrowded institution, housing both patients and prisoners. Some people said it was cursed, that strange things happened there. But I didn't buy into any of that. I needed the job. When I first walked through the doors, I felt a heaviness in the air, like something was pressing down on my chest, but I brushed it off as just the oppressive atmosphere of an old building. The hospital had its fair share of strange patients, but I didn't find that unusual. People with severe mental health issues sometimes behave in ways that are hard to understand, so I tried to keep an open mind. But there was something different about St. Mary's, something I couldn't ignore. The night shifts were the worst. The hospital had two wings, one for the long-term residents and another for the short-term patients, those who came in and out quickly. I worked in the long-term wing, the part of the hospital where the more extreme cases were kept. This was the area where the rumors about strange occurrences were born. I didn't believe them at first, but soon enough I began to experience them myself. At first, it was just the sounds. Late at night, when the halls were empty and quiet, I would hear footsteps echoing down the corridors. Soft, slow steps, as if someone was walking just out of sight. But when I went to check, no one was there. I tried to tell myself it was the building settling, the old pipes creaking or the air conditioning kicking on, but it didn't feel right. Then the patients started acting strange. They would wake up in the middle of the night, muttering about someone watching them. One woman, a patient named Margaret, insisted that the walls were closing in on her, that she could hear someone breathing right next to her in the dark. But when I checked, the room was empty. "Can you hear them?" Margaret would whisper, staring wide-eyed at the corner of the room. They're coming for me." I didn't know how to respond. There was no one in the room but the two of us, but the look in her eyes was so convincing, so desperate that it sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just her. Other patients began to say similar things. Voices in the dark, shadowy figures moving through the hallways, invisible hands grabbing at them in their sleep. Some of them said they could hear someone crying, but when we went to check, the halls were empty. I thought it was just paranoia, a side effect of the heavy medication they were all on. But I started to wonder. Something didn't add up. One night, after finishing my rounds, I stayed late to finish some paperwork. The rest of the staff had gone home, and the silence of the building felt suffocating. I could hear my own breathing echoing in the stillness. I was about to leave when I heard it, soft tapping like fingernails against the floor. It was coming from the hallway outside my office. I froze, my hand hovering over the door handle. The tapping grew louder, closer. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the tapping stopped. Dead silence. I grabbed my things and rushed out of the office, locking the door behind me. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the result of the stress of my job. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next few days were even worse. Patients continued to speak about the things they saw in the dark, figures in the shadows, voices calling their names, and more than one patient reported hearing children laughing. But there were no children in the hospital. The whole situation was beginning to make my skin crawl. One evening, I was working a late shift again when I overheard a conversation between two of the senior nurses. They were whispering about something I'd never heard before, about the history of St. Mary's. They said the hospital had been built on the grounds of an old orphanage that had burned down over 100 years ago. The fire had claimed the lives of nearly 50 children. The nurses mentioned that some of the patients in the asylum had started to claim they were children who had died in the fire. They said that the children's spirits never left, that they wandered the halls looking for someone to play with. I dismissed it as an old tale meant to frighten new staff, but then I began to hear the sounds of children's laughter myself. It was faint at first, like a distant echo, but every night it grew louder. And it wasn't just laughter, it was the sound of little footsteps running down the hall. When I would go to check, there was never anyone there. But the worst night of all came a few weeks later. It was late, just past midnight. I was making my rounds when I heard the sound of a child crying. I followed the noise down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The crying was coming from the old wing of the hospital, the part that was rarely used anymore. I wasn't supposed to be in that section, but something urged me to go. The air grew colder as I stepped through the old wooden door that led into the wing. The lights flickered as I walked down the long, narrow hall. The crying was louder now, as if the child was right there, just out of sight. I reached the end of the hall, where there was a door that led into an old, abandoned room. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and that's when I saw it. A small child, no older than 5 or 6, was standing in the middle of the room. His back was to me, and his hair was matted and dirty, hanging in long strands over his face. His clothes were ragged, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. The child was crying, his shoulders shaking with sobs. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. My voice echoed back to me, as if the building itself were mocking me. I reached out toward him, but before I could touch him, he turned around. His face was completely blank. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin. The hollow face stared at me, and the air grew so cold I could see my breath. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but the door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped in the room with the empty-eyed child. The crying stopped, replaced by a deep, low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then the lights went out. I don't know how long I was there. All I remember is the feeling of something moving around me in the dark, the weight of unseen eyes, watching, waiting. When the lights finally flickered back on, the child was gone. I didn't stay at St. Mary's much longer after that night. I packed my things and left the next morning, telling the administration I had found another position. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I don't think they would have believed me anyway. St. Mary's Asylum closed down soon after I left. No one knows exactly why, but there were whispers of strange occurrences and unexplained events that made the building unsafe. They tore it down, brick by brick, but I don't think they could ever truly erase the spirits that still linger there. To this day, I can't forget that empty-eyed child, the sound of the children's laughter, and the growl that still echoes in my nightmares.
Next story.
I didn't believe in ghosts until I met the doctor. I know it sounds like the start of some ridiculous story, but what happened at Whitewood Sanitarium isn't something I can explain away. And believe me, I've tried. I was an orderly there for just a few weeks before it all fell apart, but those few weeks changed everything I thought I knew about reality. Whitewood Sanitarium was an old mental health facility, nestled on the outskirts of a small town. It had been built over a century ago, and its towering stone structure gave it an imposing and almost ancient look. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a gothic novel or a horror movie. I had no intention of working there. It was just a job I took to make ends meet. But from the moment I walked in, I could tell something was off. The staff at Whitewood was peculiar, to say the least. There was a sort of unspoken tension between everyone, an air of secrecy that clung to the halls like dust. The patients, though, they were something else entirely. Most of them were quiet, withdrawn, lost in their own worlds. But some had these moments of lucidity, when they would look you in the eye and you could see the fear in them, a fear that I couldn't understand at first. But that all changed after I met Dr. Gregory Hale. Dr. Hale was a psychiatrist, one of the senior staff members at Whitewood. He had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and he had this unsettling calm about him. He never smiled, never joked. He wasn't cruel or overtly sinister, but there was something about him that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't just his cold demeanor, it was his eyes. They were the kind of eyes that seemed to look right through you, like he could see your deepest secrets, your darkest thoughts, with just a glance. I first noticed Dr. Hale late one night when I was doing my rounds. The sanitarium was eerily quiet, and I was walking through the long hallways, checking on patients, making sure everything was in order. I passed the office where Dr. Hale typically worked, and I saw the light under the door. The door was cracked open, and I caught a glimpse of him inside, sitting at his desk, his back to me. But there was something strange. The room was completely still, except for the slow, rhythmic tapping of a pen against the wood of the desk. It was the middle of the night. Why was he still here, tapping away in that silent, unsettling way? I hesitated, but then I shook my head and moved on. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Hale was always watching me. I would catch him in the corner of my eye, standing at the end of a hallway or peeking out from behind a door, always just out of reach. He never spoke to me directly unless it was necessary, but there was this unspoken connection between us, like he knew something I didn't. I asked a few of the other staff about him, but no one would say much. They were all either too frightened or too respectful to speak ill of him. But one evening, an older nurse, Nurse Foster, pulled me aside. She had worked at Whitewood longer than anyone else, and she had seen things. She looked at me with tired eyes, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her face. "Stay away from him," she said softly, glancing over her shoulder as if she was afraid someone might hear. "Dr. Hale isn't like the others. He's different. He's been here for too long, and things have happened, things that shouldn't be ignored. If you know what's good for you, you'll stay clear of him." At the time, I thought she was just old and paranoid, but something in her tone stuck with me. There was a deep, unsettling warning in her words, and as much as I hated to admit it, I felt a growing sense of dread every time Dr. Hale crossed my path. Then, one night, things escalated. I was making my usual rounds when I heard muffled voices coming from the hallway leading to the patient rooms. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just one of the patients talking to themselves. But as I rounded the corner, I saw Dr. Hale standing in front of room 13. It was one of the most notorious rooms in Whitewood, where the most disturbed patients were kept. I'd never seen Dr. Hale in this part of the building before, and there was something off about his presence. He was standing in front of the door, listening intently, his hand resting lightly on the knob. I called out to him, and he turned slowly, his eyes locking onto mine with that unnerving, distant gaze. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, like he was waiting for me to speak. "What are you doing here, Dr. Hale?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a long, slow breath and then, without breaking eye contact, spoke in a soft, almost whispering tone. "Do you believe in possession, Mr. Andrews?" I laughed awkwardly, not knowing how else to respond. But Dr. Hale didn't smile. His eyes only grew colder. "The mind," he continued, "is a fragile thing. It's capable of much more than you think. Sometimes a person's sanity can break, not just because of the mind itself, but because something else takes hold. Something that isn't part of them." I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I wanted to walk away, but I couldn't. I don't know what it was. whether it was his gaze or the way his voice seemed to draw me in, but I couldn't leave. He finally opened the door to room 13 and gestured for me to follow him. My heart began to pound as I stepped inside, and the air seemed to grow thicker, colder. There, lying in the bed, was a patient I hadn't seen before. He looked almost normal. His skin was pale, his eyes closed, but he was breathing slowly. It was almost peaceful, but there was something about his presence that felt wrong, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Dr. Hale stood next to the bed and placed a hand on the patient's forehead. As soon as he did, the patient's eyes snapped open and a smile spread across his face. A smile so wide, it was grotesque. "Welcome to my world," the patient whispered, his voice not his own. It was deeper, more guttural, and when he spoke, I could feel the temperature in the room drop. I stumbled back in horror, but Dr. Hale didn't move. He simply stood there, staring down at the patient, as if this were all just part of the routine. "You see," Dr. Hale said quietly, "some minds are far more malleable than others. When the right conditions are met, you can create something else, something that wasn't there before." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. And then the patient, no, the thing in the bed, turned its head to face me. Its smile grew even wider, stretching unnaturally across its face. The eyes, those eyes were no longer human. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed. I ran. I didn't look back until I was outside the building, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I tried to report what happened, but Dr. Hale was already gone. His office was empty. No one knew where he went. And the patient in room 13, he was gone too. No record of him. It was like they had never existed. I left Whitewood that day and never looked back. But every so often, I hear a faint whisper in the back of my mind, a voice that isn't my own, telling me I should have known better, telling me I should have left sooner. I don't know if Dr. Hale was a man or something else entirely, but I do know one thing. He wasn't human, and neither was the thing in room 13. And whatever they were, they're still out there, waiting for the next person to step into Whitewood and fall under their influence.
Next story.
I had always been a skeptic, the kind of person who scoffed at ghost stories and brushed off any talk of the supernatural. When people would talk about haunted places, I would just laugh and call it all a coincidence or a product of overactive imaginations. But all of that changed when I was admitted to Riverside Memorial Hospital. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. I had been in for a routine procedure, something minor that I was told would take only a couple of days for recovery. The surgery went well, but I started feeling strange once I was settled into my room. It was a small room on the 3rd floor, just across the hallway from the old section of the hospital, the part that was rarely used anymore. The nurses didn't like going near that wing, and the doctors always seemed to hurry past it when they did their rounds. At first, I didn't think anything of it. The staff was nice enough, the room was quiet, and the medicine kept me sleepy. But as the days passed, I began to notice things that didn't quite add up. The first incident happened late at night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the pain that was creeping back into my body. The hospital was quiet, the kind of silence you only get in the middle of the night. But then I heard something, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the faint scraping of shoes across the floor. I wasn't worried at first, thinking it was just a nurse or someone in the hallway. But when I glanced at the door, it was still closed. No one had come in. I stared at the door for a long time, my heart racing a little. Then I heard it again. The scraping, this time closer. It was coming from inside the room, from the corner of the room near the window. I don't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I kept my eyes fixed on the door, pretending I hadn't heard anything. I even started to breathe slowly, telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was still groggy from the medication. But the noise wouldn't stop. It came closer and closer, until it was right next to my bed, just a few feet away. I couldn't stand it anymore. I turned my head slowly, and what I saw made my heart stop. A shadow was standing in the corner. It was tall and dark, featureless, like a silhouette, but with an unsettling presence that made the hairs on my neck stand up. It wasn't the shape of a person, not exactly. It was just an absence of light, something dark and unnatural that shouldn't have been there. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I just lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the shadow seemed to grow larger, looming over me. I don't know how long it lasted. It could have been seconds or hours, but eventually, the shadow receded, and the room was silent again. The cold air returned to normal, and I was left wondering if I had imagined the entire thing. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The next morning, I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was the medication playing tricks on me. But that night, the same thing happened again. The shadow returned, this time closer, its form more distinct. I could feel it moving, its presence pressing in on me like it was getting closer to my face. I finally reached for the call button. My fingers were shaking as I pressed it, but when the nurse came in, she didn't seem surprised. In fact, she looked almost resigned. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, and when I told her what had happened, she just nodded. "You're not the first," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of sorrow. "This floor, it has a history." I asked her what she meant, but she hesitated before responding. "Years ago, there was an outbreak. A lot of people died here, right in this wing. The hospital was overcrowded, and the staff couldn't keep up. Some patients, they didn't even get the proper care. It was a disaster. After the outbreak, the hospital closed off the wing, but the patients, they never really left." I asked her if she meant that the place was haunted, but she didn't say anything. She just walked out of the room, leaving me with more questions than answers. The next night, I couldn't sleep. I was too afraid to close my eyes, too afraid of what might come for me in the dark. I could hear the same scraping noise again, this time accompanied by low whispers. I couldn't understand the words, but they sounded like they were right next to my ear, like someone was standing beside my bed, speaking directly to me. I felt the temperature drop suddenly, a coldness that pierced to my bones. The air felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence. I tried to stay calm, but the whispers grew louder. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but then I felt it, something cold brushing against my arm, like fingers, like the touch of something that shouldn't be there. When I opened my eyes, the shadow was back, but this time it wasn't alone. There were others, figures, blurry and indistinct, standing at the edge of the room, moving slowly toward me. I could see their forms shift, their outlines distorted, like they were made of smoke or fog. Their faces were blank, featureless, but their eyes, they had eyes, dark and empty, hollow pits that seemed to stare into my soul. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow reached for me, its dark fingers brushing against my skin, sending a jolt of cold through my body. The cold seeped into my bones, and the world around me seemed to blur, the room spinning as the figures closed in. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the darkness lifted. The shadows disappeared, the whispers stopped, and I was alone again in the quiet room. My body was trembling, drenched in cold sweat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, I found out the truth. It wasn't just one shadow. It wasn't just me seeing things. Several other patients had experienced similar encounters. Some had seen figures in their rooms, others heard the whispers, felt the cold. One man, a patient who had been recovering from surgery on the same floor, was found dead in his room the morning after reporting a similar encounter. His eyes were wide open, his face frozen in a look of terror, as if he had seen something too horrifying to comprehend. As the days passed, I became obsessed with finding out more about the hospital's past. I spoke to the nurses, to the doctors, anyone who might know what had happened here. That's when I learned about the old wing, the one that had been closed off years ago. It had once been a quarantine ward during a deadly outbreak of influenza. Dozens of patients had died there, many of them in agony, their suffering untold. But the worst part, the part that still sends chills down my spine to this day, was the discovery I made in the hospital records. The shadow I had seen, the ones who whispered and touched me, weren't just random spirits. They were the souls of those who had died in the quarantine ward. They had never been properly laid to rest, and their torment had twisted them into something far worse than simple ghosts. They were trapped, bound to the hospital, unable to move on. I never stayed long enough to find out what happened next. The staff moved me to another floor after I made my complaints, but I knew something dark lingered in that hospital. A presence that would never leave, a curse that no one could escape. Riverside Memorial Hospital may have continued to operate, But I knew better. Some places are too haunted to be forgotten. Some souls are too restless to be at peace.
Next story.
I had always thought of myself as a practical person. I didn't believe in superstitions, ghosts, or anything that couldn't be explained by science. But that was before I worked at Braxton Manor. Braxton Manor was an old estate tucked away in the hills just outside of town. The mansion had been standing for over a century, passed down through generations. It was a beautiful, grand place, but also a little isolated. The town folklore was full of strange stories about the mansion. Tales of mysterious disappearances, eerie noises, and sightings of a woman in a white dress. But I never gave them much thought. I was hired to do a job, help catalog and restore some of the antiques inside the mansion. And that's all I cared about. I didn't need to buy into any ghost stories. The first night I spent there was uneventful. The house creaked, of course. Old houses do that. And the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. But there was nothing to suggest anything unusual. I sat in the library, surrounded by dusty old books and paintings, making a list of the items I needed to catalog. The only sound was the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Around midnight, I decided to take a break and walk through the house. The hallways were long and dark, the only light coming from the occasional flicker of the old gas lamps. As I walked through the grand foyer, I heard something. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps following me. I stopped, my heart racing for no reason I could explain. The sound stopped too. I turned around, expecting to see someone there, but the hallway was empty. I shook my head. It was nothing, probably just the wind or an old floorboard creaking. I continued on my way, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day, I met the owner of the estate, Mrs. Thashing, Eleanor Braxton. She was an elderly woman in her late 70s, but there was something about her that struck me as unsettling. She seemed distant. She greeted me with a polite smile, but there was a coldness in her eyes that I couldn't ignore. "Do take care, dear," she said to me as I began my work. The house has a way of making people uncomfortable, especially at night. I didn't think much of her warning at the time, but as the days passed, I began to understand what she meant. I started noticing things. Small things, at first. Books that were out of place. Objects on tables that had shifted slightly, as if they had been moved when I wasn't looking. But it was the noises that were harder to ignore. The footsteps in the hallway. The soft, disembodied whispers that seemed to drift through the air at night. I chalked it all up to the house's age, to the fact that it was so large and drafty. But the more I stayed, the more I realized that I couldn't explain everything away. One night, as I was working in the library again, I heard the whispers more clearly. It was like someone was speaking directly behind me, their words too soft for me to make out. I turned quickly, but again, no one was there. My pulse quickened, and I stood still, listening. The whispering grew louder, now a series of fragmented sentences that I could almost understand. "Help her. Trapped. She can't leave." I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. The room felt colder suddenly, and the air seemed to press in around me. I grabbed my phone, trying to calm my nerves, but when I checked the time, it was well past midnight, far later than I had realized. As I started to leave the library, something caught my eye. A portrait on the far wall. I hadn't noticed it before, but now I found myself drawn to it. It was an old painting of a woman dressed in white, standing at the edge of the mansion's gardens. Her face was pale, her expression forlorn, and her eyes were fixed directly on me. I couldn't look away. I felt a strange pull in my chest, like the woman in the painting was trying to tell me something. I took a step closer, and as I did, the whispering returned, louder now. "She's waiting for you." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I backed away from the painting, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned and rushed out of the room, not daring to look back. I spent the rest of the night in my room, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next day, I told Mrs. Braxton about the strange occurrences, half expecting her to dismiss it as my imagination. But she didn't. Her face grew pale, and she stared at me for a long time before finally speaking. "That portrait," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "is of my great-great-grandmother, Clara Braxton. She lived here with her husband, Theodore. They had a tragic marriage. He was a cruel man, and she wasn't allowed to leave the house. They say she went mad, trapped here years before she died. I stared at her, confused. What do you mean, trapped? Mrs. Braxton's face grew darker. She died here, but her spirit never left. It's been said that Clara haunts the mansion, trapped in a loop, searching for someone to free her. The whispers, they come from her, trying to communicate with anyone who will listen. Most people leave before they understand, but I think she's chosen you. My blood ran cold. I thought Mrs. Braxton was just telling me a sad family story, but something in her tone told me she believed every word. I didn't know what to think. Was this just another ghost story, or was there something more to it? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the house with me. As the clock struck midnight, I decided to confront it. I made my way to the library once again, the floor creaking beneath my feet as I walked. I stood in front of the portrait, staring at Clara's face. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel the whispering again, louder this time. She's waiting for you. Without thinking, I reached out and touched the painting. As soon as my fingers made contact with the canvas, everything around me went still. The whispering stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. But then a soft voice echoed in my mind as if coming from deep within the walls. Help me. I staggered back, gasping for breath. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath in the air. The portrait seemed to shift, and for a brief moment, Clara's eyes were no longer cold and distant. They were pleading, desperate. Before I could react, the room went dark. I felt a presence behind me, cold and heavy, as if something was reaching out to me. My heart pounded, and I spun around, but no one was there. The whispering grew louder again, and then a voice, clear and urgent, spoke directly into my ear. Help me, or you'll never leave. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the front door, but as I touched the handle, I found it wouldn't budge. The house seemed to have trapped me inside, and the whispers were everywhere, growing louder, more frantic. Eventually, I managed to break free, bursting out into the cold night air. But I knew I couldn't stay. I left Braxton Manor that night, and I've never been back. They say Clara's spirit still haunts the house, waiting for someone to break the cycle, to free her from the mansion's curse. But I don't know if that's true. All I know is that I don't plan to find out.
Next story.
It all started when I took the job as a night nurse at a small hospital in a rural area. At first, it seemed like a typical place, quiet, peaceful, and old, but not in a way that made it unsettling. There was an energy there, though, something I couldn't put my finger on. Something always felt wrong, like a heavy weight in the air that no one ever spoke of, but everyone felt. I started during the winter, and the nights were long. The hospital was nearly empty, with only a few patients, mostly elderly folks, in for minor procedures or end-of-life care. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear the smallest creak of a door or the distant hum of the refrigerator in the break room. But something about the silence was different. It wasn't peaceful. It was like it was waiting, watching. The first night I worked the graveyard shift, I was assigned to monitor a patient named Mr. Gregory. He was a frail old man, often confused, but he had a certain charm about him. He told me stories of his younger days, mostly about his time in the military, and I listened attentively, happy to have someone to talk to in the stillness of the night. Around 3 a.m., the hospital seemed to shift. The lights flickered once, then twice. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe an electrical glitch. But then I heard it. A low, scraping sound, like metal against metal, coming from down the hallway. I froze, heart racing. I glanced at Mr. Gregory. He was sleeping, or at least I thought he was. I looked down the corridor, but there was no one there. The scraping noise stopped, and I shrugged it off, assuming it was just the old building settling. The place creaked and groaned like an old ship, especially in the dead of night. But then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, like someone dragging their feet down the hallway. I stood up from my chair, hoping it was one of the other nurses coming to check in, but when I looked down the hall, it was empty. The footsteps stopped abruptly. I went to check on the other patients, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to admit to myself that I was scared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I passed room after room, I noticed a strange chill in the air, despite the heat blasting through the vents. It wasn't just cold, it felt wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. At one point, I stepped into the nurse's station to grab a few supplies. As I turned to leave, I saw it, a shadow in the corner of my eye, just out of sight. I whipped around, but nothing was there. I felt a rush of panic flood my chest. I couldn't be imagining this, could I? I had to pull myself together. There was no such thing as ghosts, I told myself. But then, it happened again. I was walking past the old storage closet when I heard a whisper. It was faint, like someone calling my name. Lily. 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 The voice was soft, but it was unmistakable. I turned, but no one was there. The whispering seemed to come from everywhere, echoing down the hallway. My breathing quickened, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Mr. Gregory?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Are you okay?" I rushed back to his room. I needed to make sure he was still asleep, that he was safe, that everything was okay. But when I opened the door, the room was empty. His bed was neatly made, the sheets pulled tight, but there was no sign of him. Panic surged through me. I checked the entire room, even under the bed and in the bathroom, but he was gone. I rushed down the hall, calling his name. "Mr. Gregory? Mr. Gregory!" I looked into every room, but there was no sign of him anywhere. Finally, I returned to the nurse's station, and that's when I saw it. The small, hand-drawn sign that was taped to the desk. It said, "Mr. Gregory, room 202. The same sign that had been there when I started my shift. But how could that be? I had just seen the room empty. I rushed to the door and swung it open. And there he was, sitting in his bed, staring at the wall. He didn't acknowledge me when I called his name. He just sat there, motionless, his eyes vacant. Something wasn't right. I stayed by his side trying to keep him awake, but his mind was elsewhere. He muttered things under his breath, like he was speaking to someone I couldn't see. "They're coming for me," he whispered. "They always do. They come back to take us." His words sent chills down my spine, and my breath caught in my throat. Before I could ask him what he meant, the lights flickered again, this time violently, casting the room in sudden darkness. The power blinked and returned, but Mr. Gregory was no longer in his bed. He was standing by the window, staring out into the night. I rushed over to him, terrified of what might happen next. "Mr. Gregory, please, let me help you." But he didn't respond. His gaze was locked on something in the distance, and a faint whisper echoed from the shadows. "They'll come. They always come." Then, in an instant, he collapsed. I screamed, rushing to his side. I checked his pulse, my hands shaking, but it was too late. Mr. Gregory had passed away, but that wasn't the worst part. As I held his cold hand, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest of the room, moved across the floor, heading toward the door. It was like a figure, but not a figure, just an absence of light. It moved so fast I could barely register it, but as it passed the window, I caught a glimpse of its shape. It was tall, thin, with long, contorted limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural ways. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The shadow passed through the wall, disappearing as if it had never been there at all. I ran from the room, my heart pounding in my ears. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew I had seen something that wasn't right. It was like the building itself was alive, feeding off the souls of the forgotten, keeping them here in a twisted limbo. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I couldn't stay in the hospital after that, not alone. I went to the break room and sat there, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. But then I saw something I can't explain. In the corner of the room, on the far wall, was a drawing. It wasn't there before, I was sure of it. It was the outline of a figure, long and thin, with dark eyes and twisted features. And at the bottom it read, "They never leave." I never went back to that hospital after that night. I couldn't. The thought of it still haunts me to this day. I heard rumors later, whispers about the hospital being built on the grounds of an old asylum where the patients were treated cruelly and left to die in their cells. Some say the souls of the tormented still linger there, trapped in the walls, waiting for someone to come and join them. I don't know if that's true, but I can't shake the feeling that I was never alone in that place. Sometimes I hear the whispers again, late at night. They come to me in dreams, in the silence between breaths. They never leave, they say. We'll come for you too. And I know, somewhere deep inside, that they're waiting.
Next story.
I never thought I'd be the kind of person to believe in ghosts. I always chalked up strange happenings to coincidence, to the quirks of an old house or maybe just my imagination running wild. But after what happened at Cedar Hill Asylum, I can't deny it anymore. It started when I took a job as a night security guard at the asylum. Cedar Hill had been abandoned for years, ever since it closed down in the late 60s. The place had a reputation for being haunted, but I didn't believe in that sort of thing. I just needed the money, and the pay for overnight security was decent enough. The building itself was massive, 3 stories tall, with peeling paint and broken windows. Some of the locals had told me stories about the place. They said the asylum was built in the early 1900s to house the criminally insane, and that many of the patients had been treated cruelly. Others whispered about experiments, strange surgeries, and people disappearing into the dark corners of the building, never to be seen again. But I didn't buy into any of it. I was there to do a job and get paid. That's all. The first few nights went smoothly. The building was eerily quiet, just the hum of the security system and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. My rounds were routine. I'd check the front gate, then walk through the building, making sure every door was locked, every window secure. It was the kind of job where your mind could wander easily, and I'd often find myself thinking about life outside the asylum. That all changed on my 4th night. I was doing my usual round, walking through the dark hallways, when I heard it. At first, it was just a faint noise, like someone tapping a metal object against a wall. It wasn't much, but it made me stop in my tracks. I looked around, but the hallways were empty. The sound stopped as soon as I started to move again. I chalked it up to the old building settling and kept going. But the further I walked, the more the noises seemed to follow me. At first, it was the tapping, then a soft, dragging sound like something or someone was scraping their feet across the floor. I froze again. The sound was coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned around. There was nothing there. I must have been hearing things, I told myself. It was just my imagination, the old place playing tricks on me. I walked to the end of the hall and turned into the main corridor, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hall, in front of the old patient rooms, a door was swinging open. I was certain I had checked it earlier, but it was open now. I hesitated for a moment before walking toward it. The air in the building felt heavier, colder, and my breath came out in small puffs. I approached the door slowly, my heart beating faster in my chest. As I reached for the handle, the scraping sound came again, closer this time, as if someone was right behind me. I spun around, but once again, there was nothing, just the empty hall and the silence of the old building. I opened the door. Inside was a patient room, bare except for the old, rusted bed frame in the center. The windows were boarded up and dust hung thick in the air. But what struck me was the smell. It was the unmistakable stench of decay, like something had died in the room a long time ago. I had no idea how the room could still smell so foul after all these years. I stepped in, my flashlight sweeping across the room. As the light passed over the far wall, I stopped. There, written in what looked like dried blood, was a message. "Help me." The words were scratched into the wall, jagged and desperate. I stood frozen, my heart pounding. Then I heard it, a soft, raspy voice, like someone whispering from behind me. "Help me." I turned around so fast that I almost tripped. The room was empty, the air still and cold, but that voice, it had been so real, so close. I could still feel the echo of it in my ears. My mind raced. I needed to get out of there. Something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. I backed out of the room, my eyes darting around the hallway, but the hallway had changed. The walls seemed to be closing in and the lights flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows. The scraping sound was louder now, and it was coming from everywhere. "Help me." The voice was all around me, coming from every corner, from behind every door. I ran. I sprinted down the hall, past the old wards, past the rooms filled with empty beds, past the crumbling remains of the asylum. My breath was ragged, and my heart felt like it was going to burst. I made my way back to the security office, the pounding of my feet deafening in the silence of the asylum. I locked the door behind me and collapsed into the chair. My mind was racing, my thoughts a mess. What had I just seen? What had I just heard? I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to believe it. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in that building. I spent the rest of the night in the office trying to steady my nerves. But when morning finally came and I went to check the footage from the security cameras, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The camera in the old hallway had caught a figure, a shadow, moving across the frame. It wasn't human. It was tall, thin, and twisted, like it was made of shadows and smoke. It passed in front of the camera, moving with an unnatural speed. The timestamp on the footage showed it happening at the exact moment I had heard the voice. I don't know who or what was still haunting that place, but I knew one thing. Cedar Hill Asylum was not abandoned. It was far from empty. It was a place where the lost souls of the past lingered, trapped in some twisted version of reality, still begging for help. I left that night, never to return. I don't know if anyone else has taken the job as security guards since then, but I'd advise them to stay far away, because some places aren't just haunted by ghosts, they're haunted by the past and by the people who were never allowed to leave.
Next story.
The first time I heard about the derelict hospital on the outskirts of town, it was in passing. A rumor shared between a couple of old-timers at a diner. They talked about it like it was some forgotten secret, a dark stain in the town's history. A place where the walls had seen things that no one wanted to remember, and the silence within was thick with regret. But as curious as I was, I didn't think much of it. I had enough on my plate: work, bills, life. That was until I lost my job and found myself wandering aimlessly, looking for something to distract myself. I went to the library one afternoon to look for books on local history, something to occupy my mind. That's when I found a thick, dusty binder hidden in the corner of one of the shelves. The title read, St. Bartholomew's Hospital, The Unspoken Tragedy. I skimmed through the pages, intrigued. St. Bartholomew's had been an abandoned asylum for over 30 years, but its legacy lingered. The more I read, the more I was drawn in. Stories of patients, experiments, and unexplained disappearances. It all seemed too surreal to be true. The locals had always said the place was cursed, that the souls of those who had died there never left. But the more I read about the brutal history of St. Bartholomew's, the more I felt a strange pull to see it for myself. A week later, I was standing at the gates of the hospital. The rusted iron bars creaked as I pushed them open. A low, winded whistle rose from the broken windows above me. The place looked as though it had been abandoned in a hurry. Papers fluttered around, the ground was overgrown with weeds, and the air had a stale, musty smell. I knew I shouldn't be here. It was trespassing, and there was a part of me that knew this place had been abandoned for a reason. But something deep inside urged me to explore further, to see for myself whether the stories were true. I stepped through the main entrance, and the door groaned as I pushed it open. The air inside was colder, sharper, like something had been holding its breath for decades. My flashlight flickered weakly in the dark, casting long shadows on the walls, and I immediately noticed the peeling wallpaper, the faded murals of happy patients. Contradictions to the place's dark past. I began to wander the long, empty halls, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. Then I heard it, a soft whisper. I froze, my blood running cold. The whisper wasn't like the wind, it sounded too deliberate. Help! I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard it again, a faint, raspy whisper that came from somewhere deeper within the building. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The sound was coming from the lower levels. My legs moved on their own, leading me down the stairs to the basement. As I descended, the air grew thicker, more oppressive. The faint sound of tapping filled the air, a rhythm that grew faster as I reached the bottom. The basement was cold, and the walls were lined with rusty metal doors, each one labeled with patient numbers that had long faded into illegibility. I could barely make out the names from the faded plaques. Then I saw something. An old gurney, shoved haphazardly into a corner, with straps still attached to it. As I got closer, I noticed a dark stain on the floor, and a chill ran through me as I realized it was dried blood. My flashlight caught something else. Scratches on the wall, long, desperate marks that had been made with nails, not tools. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were louder now, coming from all directions. My breath quickened as I turned toward the source of the sound. A door at the far end of the room creaked open. Without thinking, I moved toward it, my flashlight now shaking in my hand. The door swung inward with a violent jerk, and for a moment, I thought I saw someone standing at the far side of the room. But there was no one there, only the door, and a figure written on the wall in what looked like chalk or dust. "We are waiting." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I backed up, my mind reeling with the implications of what I was seeing. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just an abandoned building. It was something far darker, something that had never been truly left behind. Suddenly, the floor beneath me gave way with a sickening crack, and I found myself tumbling into darkness. I barely had time to scream before I hit the ground with a hard thud. My flashlight fell from my hand, casting light over a small, claustrophobic room. I groaned in pain, trying to push myself up. The room smelled worse here, like decay and old, stale air. As my vision cleared, I saw what had caused the floor to give way. An old elevator shaft, long since abandoned, the ropes frayed and broken. And at the edge of the shaft, I saw something I didn't expect. A figure. A woman. Pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes staring at me from the darkness. She wore the tattered remnants of a hospital gown, her skin pale and cracked. "Help me," she whispered again, but this time her voice was different. It was like she was speaking directly into my mind, urging me to understand. "They kept me here, kept us here." I froze, unable to move, as the woman stepped forward, her feet barely touching the ground. Her limbs twitched unnaturally, and her body seemed to bend in ways that weren't possible. "I need to leave," she rasped, her voice now a shrill screech. Before I could react, the walls seemed to close in around me. The room grew smaller, tighter, the air heavier, suffocating me. The woman's eyes grew wider, her mouth opening impossibly wide in a scream that rattled my bones. The floor beneath me seemed to give way again, but this time I couldn't escape. I was falling into darkness, into the same fate as those who had been trapped here before me, their souls bound to the place for eternity. I woke up in the hospital's front lobby hours later, sprawled on the dusty floor, disoriented and confused. My flashlight was gone. The doors were locked as if they had never been opened. And the whispers, the woman, everything seemed to have been nothing more than a nightmare. But when I got up and glanced toward the old elevator shaft, I saw the faintest trace of a handprint on the wall, smeared in what looked like ash. It wasn't my handprint, and that's when I knew. Some places don't just stay abandoned. Some places are waiting, and some ghosts aren't content to rest. They just want to make sure you never leave.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a routine check. Just another night spent monitoring the surveillance at St. Augustine's Psychiatric Hospital. I had only been working as an overnight tech for a few weeks, but everything had seemed normal, at least up until tonight. St. Augustine was one of those old hospitals that was built in the early 1900s, with tall, imposing brick walls and a labyrinth of corridors that all seemed to lead to nowhere. The place had a grim history. Patients treated with shock therapy, lobotomies, and other now outdated procedures. It closed down years ago, and now the city used it for storage and occasionally offered tours to those brave enough to explore its history. Most people avoided it, especially after dark, but I didn't care about the place's past. I just needed the job. My shift usually involved sitting in front of monitors and making sure the cameras were working and that no one was wandering where they shouldn't be. It wasn't exciting, but it paid the bills. I'd watch the footage of empty hallways, quiet rooms, and the occasional cleaning crew making their rounds. That night, the usual silence was interrupted by something strange. The cameras in the north wing, a section of the hospital that hadn't been used in years, flashed to life. I wasn't sure why I was even watching that particular feed. It was set to a motion sensor that I rarely paid attention to, but when the feed came on, it caught my eye. A figure, thin, gaunt, was pacing back and forth in front of one of the patient rooms. I squinted, unsure if I was seeing things. The figure appeared to be wearing an old hospital gown, and its movements were jerky, unnatural. It stopped in front of the door, then turned and paced again. I froze. My mind raced. Who could that be? No one should have been in that wing. I quickly dialed the security office, but no one picked up. That wasn't unusual. Security was probably dealing with something with something elsewhere in the building. So I did what I thought was best. I grabbed the walkie-talkie and called in. "Hello? Is anyone else on duty?" There was static. Then a crackling voice answered. "This is Officer Phelps." "Who is this?" "It's Aaron in the monitoring room. I'm seeing something on the cameras in the north wing. There's a figure there pacing in front of room 201. No one should be there. What do you want me to do?" There was a long pause. "Aaron, stay put. We'll handle it," Phelps finally said, his voice oddly flat. "Just keep an eye on the cameras. Don't engage." I was a little relieved. I wasn't trained for situations like this, but there was something off about Phelps' tone. He wasn't worried, just matter of fact. I had never seen him act like that before. I returned my attention to the cameras, watching the figure continue its pacing. It was unnerving. Its movements seemed deliberate, as if it were trapped in a loop, walking the same path over and over again. I saw it stop in front of the door once more, its head tilted as if listening. Then, in the blink of an eye, it turned and disappeared down the hallway. I jumped out of my seat, my heart pounding. Then, something even stranger happened. The lights in the north wing flickered. They blinked on and off in rapid succession before finally going out entirely. The cameras turned to static, leaving me with nothing but a blank screen. I tried to contact security again. "Phelps, I lost the feed. The lights are out and the cameras are down. Static." Then, a cold voice came through the walkie-talkie. It was no longer Phelps. "Leave now." My blood ran cold. I'd never heard that voice before. It wasn't Phelps. The voice was low, guttural, almost like it was coming from the walls themselves. I couldn't speak. I felt like I was being suffocated by an invisible presence. My body was frozen, unable to move. Then I remembered something I had read about St. Augustine's history. The North Wing had been notorious for housing patients who were considered unfit for treatment. Many of them had died there, often in isolation. The building had been built with long, narrow hallways, and at one point, rumors had spread that patients had been kept in the dark, chained to their beds. There had been whispers about strange noises coming from the area, voices calling out for help from rooms that had long been locked. Suddenly, the door to the monitoring room slammed shut. I jumped, my heart in my throat. The cold, heavy air in the room made it feel like I was suffocating. I could barely breathe. My mind raced with thoughts of escape, but my legs felt like lead. I grabbed the walkie-talkie again. "Phelps, I need you. I'm locked in the monitoring room. The door won't open." Static. The door handle jiggled. Someone or something was on the other side. I backed away, my hands trembling, my eyes darting around the room for something to defend myself with, but I was alone in the dark. I didn't even know what was real anymore. Then I heard it. The soft tapping. It was coming from the far corner of the room. I turned. The shadow of a figure moved in the darkness, its silhouette just visible in the low light from the emergency exit sign. It was pacing again, just like the figure from the north wing. It stopped in front of me. The lights flickered on, and I saw it clearly for the first time. The figure wasn't wearing a hospital gown. It was wearing chains, thick, rusted chains wrapped around its body. Its face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce into my soul. It didn't speak, but I could hear it. The voice that had whispered earlier, repeating over and over in my mind, "Leave now, or stay forever." In that moment, I realized I was no longer in control. This place wasn't just haunted by memories. It was haunted by the souls of the forgotten, the souls of those who had died here, tortured and abandoned. They weren't ghosts. They were trapped, lingering in the darkness, waiting for someone to hear their call. Before I could move, the figure reached out, its cold fingers grazing my cheek. And just like that, I was no longer in the monitoring room. I don't know how long I was out, but when I came to, I was lying in the hallway outside the north wing. The building was quiet again, as if nothing had ever happened. The cameras were working and the lights were back on. I managed to stagger to my feet and stumble out of the building. When I spoke to Phelps the next day, he acted like nothing had happened. There was no mention of the figure, no explanation for the strange voice or the locked door. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched by something in that hospital, something that never left.
Next story.
I remember the first time I saw her. It was a rainy evening, the kind where the sky feels heavy, like it's about to crack open. I had just started working as a security guard at Hillcrest Memorial Hospital, a rundown facility on the edge of town. It had been abandoned for years, and they were in the process of demolishing it, but the construction crew left the night shift to us. My job was simple: patrol the building, make sure nothing was stolen or vandalized, and report anything unusual. I thought it would be easy money. That night, I was doing my usual rounds, walking through the echoing hallways when I noticed something strange. The lights flickered above me as I walked down the corridor, and the silence of the place felt wrong. Hospitals are never truly quiet. There's always the hum of machines, the shuffle of nurses' feet, or the distant beeping of monitors. But Hillcrest had none of that. It was just still, as if it were holding its breath. I reached the old ICU wing, a part of the hospital that had been abandoned even before the place shut down. It had a reputation for being the most haunted part of the building. The rumor was that the hospital had once been home to an experimental treatment for terminally ill patients. The treatment was controversial, and many patients had died there under mysterious circumstances. Some said their spirits never left. I had heard the rumors, of course, but I was never one to believe in ghosts. Still, there was something unnerving about the ICU. As I walked past the old rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced down one of the hallways and saw a figure at the far end. It was a woman, standing motionless in the dim light. She was tall, with long dark hair, wearing an old-fashioned hospital gown. Her back was to me, but I could see her head tilted slightly, as if she was listening for something. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, but I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light. Maybe it was some leftover shadow from the flickering lights, or maybe someone else had come in, though that seemed unlikely at this time of night. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even move. I took a step forward, and that's when it happened. The temperature in the hallway dropped sharply. I could see my breath in the air, despite the humidity of the rain outside. The woman's head snapped to the side, and for a moment her eyes met mine. I felt the air rush out of my lungs, and a chill crawled up my spine. Her eyes weren't human. They were hollow, dark, like deep pools of endless night. The rest of her face was pale, almost sickly white, and her mouth stretched into a twisted, unnatural grin. Her teeth were jagged, sharp, like something you'd see in a nightmare. Before I could react, she turned away and began walking down the hall. I should have run, should have turned and fled, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I followed her, telling myself it was just some weird prank or a person who had gotten in somehow. I walked after her, my footsteps muffled on linoleum floor. She moved with an eerie, unnatural grace, gliding just above the floor. As I got closer, I noticed something even more unsettling. The woman didn't cast a shadow. I tried to call out to her again, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my voice stuck in my chest. I reached the end of the hallway where the woman had disappeared through a door that hadn't been opened before. The door creaked as I pushed it open, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside, the room was as dark as the hallway, but something caught my eye. On the floor in the center of the room was a large, blood-stained circle. The walls were covered in old, peeling paint, and the windows were boarded up. But it was the floor that terrified me. The bloodstains were fresh, as if someone had died there just moments ago. I stepped into the room cautiously, my senses screaming at me to leave. I didn't know why, but I had to know what was going on. As I reached the center of the bloodstain, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the dark. I turned around, but there was no sign of the woman. She had vanished, just like that. And then I heard it, a soft whisper just beyond the edge of hearing, followed by a voice, low and guttural. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, my heart racing, but I saw nothing. The room was empty. The woman was gone, but I could still hear her voice echoing in my head over and over again. "Leave. Leave now." I didn't wait to hear it again. I bolted for the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the handle. The door wouldn't open. Panic surged through me. I slammed against it, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. "Leave." The whisper grew louder, coming from all directions. My mind felt like it was unraveling, like something was clawing at my brain, pulling me into madness. And then, just as I thought I would lose control, the door swung open. I didn't hesitate. I ran down the hallway, stumbling over my own feet, like not daring to look back. I could still hear her, still feel her presence just behind me. But I couldn't bring myself to stop. I burst out of the hospital into the rain, gasping for air as if I had been holding my breath for hours. I never went back to Hillcrest after that night. I quit the job the next day and moved far away from that town. But even now, I can't escape the memory of the woman in the hospital gown, her hollow eyes, and that chilling whisper that still echoes in my mind. And I know, deep down, that she's still there, still waiting in the darkness of Hillcrest Memorial Hospital for someone else to come looking, someone else to hear her whisper. But I won't be that person again.